Davos, Switzerland, January 2026, the World Economic Forum. The official theme is a spirit of dialogue. The reality, geopolitical fragmentation is accelerating and AI sits right at the center. President Donald Trump took the stage accompanied by the largest US delegation in WEF's history. While Davos 2026 had 5 central key themes this year, AI infiltrated every single one. In this video, I break down the 10 key signals emerging from the forum about AI's future trajectory based on what the most important voices in AI actually said. If you're new here, my name is Walter Pasquarelli. I've spent the last 10 years working with government ministers and businesses on artificial intelligence. I'm also a research affiliate at Cambridge University. This is Davos 2026. The first signal from Davos this year is that AI power is becoming territorial. And of course, the issue that has been on everyone's minds this year has been the topic of Greenland. In the days leading up to the World Economic Forum this year, President Trump intensified his campaign to acquire the semi-autonomous Danish territory, which included threatening tariffs at his closest European allies. This was one of the most dominant topics at this year's forum. Now, why does a territorial dispute matter for AI's future? The answer is that Greenland is, among other things, a supply chain symbol. The AI economy depends increasingly on resources that tend to be increasingly scarce. Think of, for example, energy, rare earth elements, and critically minerals. Now, Greenland holds about 39 out of the 50 minerals that the US designated as critical minerals on its strategic lists. Some of its deposits include, for example, germanium and gallium. China controls about 98% of the global gallium supply and about 60% of germanium across the world. And they've also increased export controls to prevent any kinds of competing nations to be able to get a hold of these minerals. This matters, especially in a context where the world and especially the US administration is framing artificial intelligence increasingly as this race, as this big power competition that will determine ultimately who will stay on top of the global political and economic order. And the Trump administration has been explicit of this connection between Greenland and artificial intelligence. House Speaker Mike Johnson stated that America's pursuit of Greenland has to do on the one hand with national security, but similar as well about getting a hold of these critical minerals. Trump himself has provided kind of contradictory remarks on this. First it was about minerals, then it was only about national security. At Davos, he did state that he's not planning to use quote-unquote excessive force to get a hold of Greenland. What matters here is that AI geopolitics has become increasingly resource geopolitics. So the cloud itself has now become really a question of who controls the land, who controls the grids, and the minerals, and ultimately the raw materials for advancing in artificial intelligence. This increased competition then leads us to the second signal, which is that AI governance could be increasingly characterized less from a rules-based order, but more based on clubs and individual blocks of states competing with each other. Now, this matters enormously because artificial intelligence is, on the one hand, a technology that lends itself, from the point of view of capabilities, to be dominated just by a handful of states and a handful of entities. And we see that in part because there are only a handful of actors currently are really able to develop the large language models or the most advanced AI models, because they require a lot of computing infrastructure, a lot of energy, and a majority of states are not able to provide them to develop their own kinds of models. Now, the Trump administration has put forward a so-called Board for Peace. And it should be said here that the Board for Peace was initially a conflict resolution organization intended for Gaza. But increasingly, we see also like analysts that are saying that these kinds of boards, predominantly chaired by the president for a lifetime, would expand into several other areas, including artificial intelligence. The makeup is essentially that any kinds of actors would be able to pay $1 billion and then through that get access to this kind of boards. And a number of nations have already confirmed. Several leading political figures such as Emmanuel Macron have criticized this and have tried to really push back against this initiative to compete, kind of like competing blocs and regimes. Ursula von der Leyen said that Europe now has to be more independent. The Canadian Prime Minister said that essentially the existing global order is over. But for the field of artificial intelligence, this shows that there's going to be not one global AI governance future, but it could really be that we're going to see different competing, overlapping governance regimes handled and directed by various kinds of actors. The competing nature of these regimes seems to be increasingly a defining characteristic of the field of AI governance as a whole. But fragmentation is not only something that would happen on the geopolitical international state, but signal number 3 shows us that the US is really far from being internally aligned as well. Anthropic CEO Dario Amodei, for example, criticized the Trump administration at Davos 2026 because they are now selling AI chips to China. He called it crazy and even likened it to selling nuclear weapons to North Korea, which is a pretty strong statement from an American tech CEO. For context, on January 14, 2026, Trump imposed a 25% tariff on certain advanced AI chips. However, the administration simultaneously decided to allow NVIDIA to sell its H200 chips to China. The H200 chips are slightly more dated than the more cutting-edge ones. Now, this is strong criticism from all sides of the political aisle. We had, for example, Senator Elizabeth Warren, who attacked it and said it's essentially giving Beijing a path to catch up in AI. Amodei, on the other hand, criticized that export controls could allow the US to buy time for the US to handle AI safely, time for governance to catch up, time to preserve a lead. But at the end of the day, the split does expose a fundamental tension within the US AI strategy. But these 3 signals ultimately boil down to the 4th one, brought forward perhaps most clearly by Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella, and essentially is that compute is becoming a strategic currency. Satya Nadella introduced a frame that might prove pretty consequential, and that's that tokens are becoming a global commodity. So what did he mean by that? Essentially, Nadella argued that data centers are becoming token factories. So facilities that will convert energy essentially into AI capacities. These will diffuse across the world based on patterns influenced by, on the one hand, an ability to provide the energy requirements, providing the right kinds of infrastructure. But critically, Nadella's argument is that GDP growth of nations across the world may be directly tied to their ability to be able to provide these resources, the raw materials, the energy, to be able to power artificial intelligence. That means naturally that countries with abundant energy sources, whether that's from hydrocarbon, solar, or renewables, will be able to secure a pretty strong competitive advantage in the future economy shaped by artificial intelligence. Now, we've covered data centers extensively. We published a video about it just last week. You can find it in the description box, link below. But what this tells us is that AI power and dominance will not just be defined by who has the best AI apps or the fanciest model, but really about who has access to abundant and cheap intelligence at scale. Now, moving on to the 5th signal of Davos 2026, the actual builders of AI are warning that AI development is outpacing governance. One of the most discussed sessions was titled "The Day After AGI," and that featured, for example, Google DeepMind CEO Demis Hassabis, as well as Anthropic CEO Dario Amodei, and it was chaired and moderated by the editor-in-chief of The Economist. Hassabis declared that AI is already today able to match or even outpace humans in particular kinds of tasks. There have been several studies produced on that. But critically, he says that artificial general intelligence, AGI, that means AI that is essentially able to match or even outcompete us across all tasks, might just be 5 to 10 years away. He said that this might, of course, put us directly into uncharted territory as far as, on the one hand, safety is concerned, but critically also about jobs. And the challenge that he highlighted is that essentially it's not going to be just about what jobs we're going to have, our salaries, how much we're going to earn, but really what our purpose and meaning will be in our lives. And Amodei described AI essentially already now knocking at the door of incredible possibilities, but he also said that the next years will be critical for ensuring that a good governance regime is put in place to be able to manage this technology safely. And unlike the typical techno-optimism of Silicon Valley, both leaders sounded the alarms, and they said that currently AI safety regimes and governance mechanisms are essentially being rushed. Demis Hassabis in particular said that potentially it might be a good idea to be a little slower so that we can get this right. So what we see here is there's a clear tension. When's the right moment? Are we being too quick? But then on the other hand, the capabilities of AI are increasing drastically. This brings us then to signal number 6, which is about a new risk that has been highlighted at Davos. Now, Yoshua Bengio, who is one of the Turing Award winners and largely considered to be one of the godfathers of AI, warned that artificial intelligence is increasingly adopting human-like capabilities, something that we also describe as anthropomorphism. Essentially, an AI that sounds like a human, behaves like a human when we speak to it, and makes us feel and think that we're talking to an actual person. Now, this relates to what has been highlighted in the State of AI Companions report, which essentially tried to analyze how people are interacting with AI tools, the kind of secrets they share with it, the extent to which they listen and make decisions in critical areas of their life, like in health, in dating, in their mental health, in managing their finances. I've linked the State of AI Companions report below. Have a look. Essentially, the issue here is that from all the evidence that we have, people don't think that AI is a human being. They know it's a chatbot, but what they report is that they feel it's a persona. There is something, there's almost an entity behind it that is interacting with them. And that is also one of the reasons why, as some of the State of AI Companion research showed, why 7.5% of millennials report that they rely emotionally on artificial intelligence. Another 30 to 40% have already substituted expert advice from their doctor, their therapist, or a trusted friend from advice provided by a chatbot. That is massive. And the perception, what is real, what is not, a redefinition of what authenticity is, will be one of the most critical points and questions that we will have to answer as far as the implications of artificial intelligence for society. And because human versus AI expertise are increasingly in competition, this is the perfect segue into signal number 7. Labor market disruption has been discussed with unusual candor. Most notably, the managing director of the International Monetary Fund forecasted that because of AI, a tsunami is hitting the labor markets. And they said that approximately 40% of all global jobs might actually be impacted by artificial intelligence, and predominantly work and jobs in advanced economies as opposed to emerging ones. This is a bit of a tricky topic. It should be said that across all studies that have been produced so far, there is not one definitive resources that can accurately match and report on what the impacts of artificial intelligence will be on jobs. To provide you with some context, the World Economic Forum 2020 produced the Future of Jobs report, where they said that AI will probably create more jobs than it will take away. 2023, after the release of ChatGPT, they became a lot more pessimistic, where they said AI will take more jobs than it will create. And then in 2025, they became very optimistic and said AI will create a lot more jobs. Now they've kind of settled in 2026 on providing almost like a 4 futures framework, which is almost like a scenario planning, which I think is a very welcome and much more mature development. We don't know what the impact is. And that's because the current projections provide a snapshot of where the technology currently is, and we can speculate where it will go. But it's impossible for me, for you, for anyone to accurately say this is where AI will go. There's been tons of predictions across the entirety of the ecosystem, most of them proved in the best case to be inaccurate. But what the evidence does agree on is that there's going to be a critical window between 2027 and 2030 where the impact of AI on the labor market will be felt. And the way to mitigate that is undoubtedly going to be to invest in upskilling, on the one hand through government programs, but also through public-private partnerships with businesses. And that highlights also the crux of the problem. At the moment, according to the World Economic Forum studies, about 89% of organizations plan that they want to upskill some of their workers to match the requirements of a labor market shaped by artificial intelligence. However, about 40% have already done that. Now, that gap between intention and action will set the stage for what is going to happen in the labor markets. It means that AI is not just going to be a technology that shapes jobs, but it will also be the main catalyst for social mobility. Now, on to the 8th and perhaps also more exciting signal of Davos 2026. We can see that the interface layer of AI is expanding. Historically, the main device that we use to access our most cutting-edge technologies, think of the internet, think of AI chatbots, has been the smartphone. But increasingly, we see a push and a criticism really for saying the smartphone is not up to date anymore because artificial intelligence is ambient based. It relies maybe on computer vision to be able to see our surroundings, and maybe it relies also on understanding our voices when we speak to it. So the smartphone itself may be slowly on its way out, as I had been reporting on already repeatedly over the past years. The most interesting announcement probably came from OpenAI. Interestingly, Sam Altman himself did not attend Davos 2026. However, OpenAI's Chief Global Affairs Officer did. And it has already been reported quite substantially that OpenAI is working on a new hardware device. From all we know so far is that this is going to be a small, screenless device, possible a wearable. And from my own research that I've done on the back of this, there have been some rumors floating around that this could be a so-called smart pen called Gumdrop. It's not clear yet what it will be able to do, but it does fit some statements made by Sam Altman that this will be a much calmer device as opposed to, for example, a smartphone. What this means, however, for the field of AI as a whole is that governance will likely not only be about the resources, about the safety, about who controls the compute, but soon it will also be related about who controls the access point, the interface layer, the hardware to access artificial intelligence. Now, signal number 9 is that beyond the concerns around geopolitical competition, resource constraints, and the safety issues of artificial intelligence, there is actually also quite a lot of optimism and excitement about the positive use cases of artificial intelligence that are currently emerging. And for example, the president of the World Economic Forum came forth and said, well, we think that artificial intelligence will help us to create scientific breakthroughs in medicine and biology, and essentially help us serve potentially people that didn't have access to more advanced and complete treatments. This was also complemented by Novartis, a pharmaceutical firm, who reported that at the moment, about less than 10% of all global diseases can be meaningfully addressed through existing treatments. And artificial intelligence could really help skyrocket and boost the development of new pharmaceuticals and new treatments to bring them onto the market. To provide you with some numbers, currently a new drug takes about sometimes 10, sometimes 20 years and an enormous amount of resources until it reaches the market. But some evidence shows that by using AI tools, the time for drug discovery has been able to be cut down to nearly 2 years. The final signal is about what was not discussed at Davos. And typically we see Davos being usually attended by some of the largest business owners, eminent CEOs, great inventors, of course, heads of states, as we saw. But there have been some voices from all the reports and the attendance list that we looked at that have been underrepresented. The first one is the labor market perspective. And while the topic of AI's impact on the labor market was discussed extensively, representatives from, for example, labor unions were vastly underrepresented. Some of these perspectives on other reports outside of Davos would probably include issues around who benefits actually from the productivity gains that are produced from artificial intelligence. The question around AI and jobs is not only about how many jobs in absolute numbers are going to be created, but also who gets these new jobs and what happens to the people that might potentially become impacted or affected by this new technology. This relates intimately to one of the points that Satya Nadella made, which is for AI to be able to benefit the world and society at large, it needs to be diffused or adopted across various kinds of countries and economies. The voice of the Global South would have probably included questions around, will AI actually increase the divide between the Global North and the Global South? What are issues around resource extractions? And of course, who controls the AI infrastructure and who makes it accessible under what terms? And the third point then is about civil liberties. Now, it's understandable that based on what's happening right now in the world, a lot of the conversation centered around geopolitical competition between nations, but really, at least based also on what, for example, Eric Schmidt said at Davos, one of the main fears of people at the moment is that AI might create a loss of freedom. And this could be essentially loss of freedom from AI being used in surveillance regimes. Think of the social credit system. But it could also be a much more implicit way that we essentially become more dependent on AI because of the decline in cognitive abilities that it might create. Now, to conclude, Davos' theme around a spirit of dialogue does feel a little bit quaint against this backdrop. If anything, what Davos has shown us is that the field of artificial intelligence is really changing rapidly, and AI is meeting an increasingly fragile world. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this video helpful, like, subscribe, share. Let me know in the comment section below if you agree, maybe I missed something. This video is part of a series of deep dives and explainers and analysis that I publish every single week on this channel. If you prefer reading, I also publish a weekly long read every single week that you can find in the description box below. Till the next time.